The island. It was a beautiful Christmas Eve, and I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the endless ocean and the many stars above me. I hardly felt that I was riding in the tail turret of a big airplane many thousands of miles from home. After a moment, I came back to the real world, glanced at my watch, and noticed that it was 0100, an hour into Christmas Day. Then my mind drifted again to home, and Christmas has passed with family and friends, and I wondered how they would spend this Christmas. Where might I be next Christmas? This is probably my one and only feeling of homesickness in my life. But I am an eternal optimist and had learned early in life that it's best to take a day at a time, and usually the future would take care of itself. Suddenly I was back in the real world again as the plane droned on through the night. I reflected on the previous day when we flew in over Ulithi Atoll. I was amazed. It had to be the biggest harbor I had ever seen. It would easily accommodate 1,000 ships of all types, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, etc., etc. It was overwhelming to imagine the destructive power that was often represented there. Task Force 58 alone, which is probably the best-known naval force ever assembled, consisted of over 360 ships. I often thought had the Japanese commanders seen such an array of force, they might have had some second thoughts. Ulithi Atoll itself is about halfway between the Philippines and Guam. As huge as the atoll is, it is made up of many sand and coral strips of varied sizes, and like many of the atolls in the Pacific, is the result of volcanic action. Ulithi had become a major staging base for future action against the Japanese. It was also a fleet recreation facility for ship-weary sailors to get ashore for a few hours and relax with a couple of cold beers. Ulithi has a lagoon 19 miles long and from 5 to 10 miles wide. Mogmog on the northern end of the lagoon was the recreation area. An interesting story about Ulithi is told in the following report from the Washington, D.C. Daily News. Meet Frank Kilroy of Mogmog, Ulithi. I can truthfully say that Kilroy was there when I write about Mogmog, one of the islands at Ulithi, because my name is Kilroy, and I was at Ulithi for a number of months with Command Service Squadron 10. Probably few of you have ever heard of Ulithi, because the Navy kept it pretty hush-hush. It was an atoll 108 miles from the Jap stronghold of Yap. It was a major Navy base of its kind during the closing stages of the Pacific War. When the Navy took over Ulithi from the Japs, the natives were moved from Mogmog to Passerai Island, and Mogmog became the recreation island for the fleet. The Navy set up a cooling plant for beer and cokes, as well as baseball diamonds, basketball courts, and a boxing arena. There was also a bathing beach, and many boys took advantage of the opportunity during their 2 or 3 hours ashore to cool off in the warm waters of the Pacific. The native architecture was of a high gable type with sharply sloping, gracefully curved roofs. Before they were evicted by the Navy, about 95 natives had lived on Mogmog, so I'm told, a very religious people. The group of islands that we knew as Ulithi was originally known as the Mackenzie Islands and had been discovered, as reported, by Diego de Roche, a Portuguese skipper in the year 1526. Mogmog was reasonably insect-free, and the only type of reptile I saw there were very small geckos of the lizard family, and they were quite harmless. There were a few coral snakes and snake-like conger eels, but we left them strictly alone. They say a gecko will drop its tail if you grab one that way, and the appendage will wiggle in your fingers for a moment or so because the nerves remain alive after the tail is dropped. The Liberty area of Mogmog was fairly well covered with coconut palms, and in the center of the island was a small swamp, choked with taro plants, the roots of which the natives bake or boil, and which are so important to them as potatoes are to us. About in the center of the grove was a palm-thatched bandstand, where on special days a band of black musicians made hot music and plenty good, too. Drinking beer took just about 2/3 of the time that Liberty parties were allowed to remain ashore. But even before we had taken Okinawa, it was possible to buy genuine small-sized 10-yen notes right from Okinawa. There's a great deal more that could be said about Mogmog, or at least about the men who went ashore there, but I believe that just this little bit will serve to recall to the many soldiers, sailors, and Marines who spent a few hours there the wonderful feeling it was to stand on land just once more before pushing on to the west and north to demonstrate to the Japs that they had picked on the wrong people when they attacked Pearl Harbor. No other nation could have put together such a secret floating base as Ulithi. With best wishes to the many other Kilroys of the World War II who were there, I am Frank X. Kilroy, Alexandria, Virginia. P.S. After 40 months with the Navy, however, I can truthfully say I am not the Kilroy whose name is seen in most public places. At the risk of reputation, I never ceased to be amazed as we took off or landed at Ulithi at the huge numbers of ships that might be anchored there on a given day. I counted 20 aircraft carriers one day, while we were taxiing out for takeoff. As an addendum to that, I remember one patrol when we came across a fleet of ships, later identified as a task unit of Task Force 58. Arrayed from horizon to horizon, from my vantage point in the tail, were ships. A flotilla of 7 fleet aircraft carriers, 8 light aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, some 60 destroyers, and an array of support ships, fleet oilers, ammo ships, so forth. This was truly an awesome sight, and I remember hearing that later that it took about 4 or 5 hours to get a fleet this size underway to sail out of an anchorage. Mogmog Island. We were all delighted that we could occasionally go ashore on Mogmog, where the fleet recreation area was located. Complete with cold beer and solid ground, it was a welcome change. There were ball fields, volleyball courts, and other sports facilities. We got to go ashore for a couple of hours. As I recall, the beer was terrible stuff, brand name Acme, made in Washington State, and tasting it like it was aged about 5 days. However, it was like Dom Perignon to a thirsty sailor. One of the downsides about going to Mogmog was the fighting, ship against ship. All it took at times was a question, what ship are you on? And a melee would break out, fueled by a few beers and guys wanting to let off steam. Fortunately, the shore patrol was tough and would break fights up with a liberal use of nightsticks. I always wore my CB greens ashore instead of my blue dungarees, so that I wasn't identified as a shipboard sailor, but rather one of the construction battalion who were most well respected by everyone. One of the Chandelier's crew told me a great beer story about Mogmog. As was the custom, ship's personnel brought their own beer, usually hot, from their own ship's supply. When they arrived on the island, they swapped it for cold beer, kept in large reefers. As the crew members got their ration of beer, they gingerly lifted the caps off and drank the delicious stuff. They then collected all their empties and went down to the beach and filled them with seawater and recapped the bottles. Then they returned and swapped their counterfeit beers for a like amount of cold ones. There obviously were some pretty mad sailors who got the Chandelier's beer when they checked in at Mogmog and swapped their real stuff for it. Operations in action. On the 27th of December, for the first time since October, all of the squadron's personnel were housed on one tender, the Chandelier. The ship was crowded, but it seemed much easier from an operational standpoint to everyone on the same ship. Our basic assignment here was to fly 2 daily patrols, 500-mile sectors, as well as 2 all-night ASPs, anti-submarine patrols, around the atoll in concentric squares. These night patrols, dusk to dawn sweeps, were to seek out enemy submarines, hoping to catch them on the surface recharging batteries. The Japanese submarine fleet was very active around Ulithi, Palau, Manus, and over to the Philippines because of the volume of shipping in that area. On most of our ASPs, we seldom saw submarines, but just being there was probably a good deterrent. The Japanese knew we had regular patrols covering most areas of this part of the Pacific. The unwritten rule of ASW is to keep subs submerged, because their speed and maneuverability is much diminished. Also, keeping submarine commanders wary was the name of the game. Occasionally on ASP we would come across whales, and it was rumored that one of the crews had inadvertently dropped depth charges on one. Like Castle Passage, there were no beaching facilities for seaplanes, so the tender provided all needed logistical and maintenance support. The sheltered waters of the lagoon were a welcome respite after the sea conditions experienced at Castle. Buoy watch was almost enjoyable with the calm water. Several of our planes had badly beaten up hulls as a result of the typhoon at Castle and were shipping water to an alarming extent. Crew 1's plane had worse problems and spent several weeks at Manus Island undergoing extensive hull repairs. As our level of patrol activity increased, and with it major overhaul problems, it was decided that future major maintenance would be performed at bigger Tanapag seaplane base on Saipan. Tanapag Harbor thus became a major facility for us, other PBM squadrons, as the war raged on. Flying patrols. Flying patrols could be boring, scary, always long, and almost always alone. To provide a better insight into flying a patrol in a PBM, I've described one of our day patrols from pre-flight and takeoff to landing. Each patrol had a certain established routine to be followed, but depending upon what was seen during the flight, adjustments were frequently made. On the following page, I've included a daily operations schedule which outlines the routine for the squadron for the day of Saturday, January 13, 1945. As has been said, each crew was different, tending to reflect their PPC's personality and having their own disciplines. Inasmuch as we almost always flew alone, we seldom knew what the other crews were doing, and as a result, we only knew part of the overall picture. The admirals and other commanders made the big decisions, and we followed orders, often not knowing where we were going until we were in the plane ready for takeoff, not always without some apprehension, which is only human. I was always amazed at how little we knew about the big picture of the war and how little the crews talked about their experiences. Every crew knew it was a possibility that action would occur. The only question was to what extent. So we worked in a lonely environment, not knowing all we would like to, or in some instances should have. Even though many of our patrols were long and boring, the tension of never knowing when something might happen worked on everyone's nerves, even though most would not admit it. One day's patrol. Crew 14 was now comprised of 3 pilots, 4 aviation machinist mates, 3 aviation radiomen, and 2 aviation ordnancemen. Takeoff for day patrols was usually at 06:45, which meant reveille at 500. For members of the crew not on buoy watch. The buoy watch would also get up early and perform a number of pre-flight tasks. Visual check of control surfaces, checking and pumping bilges, checking engines for ever troublesome exhaust stacks, checking oil, checking fuel loading, and also checking fuel for water or foreign matter, cleaning cockpit windows, stowing any loose gear from night watch, and so on down the list. When working from the tender, the crew members who spent the night on board would have procured the day's flight rations and assembled on deck for transport to the plane by boat. Arriving at the plane and with everyone safely on board, pre-flight routine started in earnest. Everyone donned their May vests. We had all been indoctrinated to the fact that for security reasons, we were not to carry any personal material like letters in our pockets when flying. The only real identifying information that we could have were the official dog tags, which had name, serial number, and blood type on them. As all hatches were secured except for the bow hatch, which was not secured until we cast off from the buoy, and the hatch on the putt-putt deck, which led up to the wing, where one of the crew stayed with the fire extinguishers until the engines were started. Then they quickly ducked back into the plane and secured each of the hatches. This particular patrol, I was serving as flight engineer for the first part of the flight. I must admit I was always a bit nervous about being in charge. Joe Durda was flying his PPC this day, with Walt Melmar flying as co-pilot. When Durda was ready to start engines, he informed me and I began working through my checklist. I still remember some of the routine as follows. With the auxiliary power unit operating, I began the checklist, checked that the pilot had ignition switches off, checked all power plant controls, fuel valves off, mixture control idle, auxiliary generator on, battery switch on, carburetor air control direct, cowl flaps full open, oil cooler flaps open, supercharger controls low. Then I flicked the starter switches to turn the engine over a few times. Then I put the engine selector valve to service tank and checked fuel. Then I told Durda, ready to start engines. He hit his ignition switch, put the propeller selector switch to auto, and the governor handles to full RPM, with throttle set to 600, 800 RPM. Now we were ready to go. Flight engineer to pilot, ready to start starboard engine, I'd say. And I energized the starter and held down the primer switch until the starboard engine caught. As the engine started firing, I put the mixture control to full rich and checked the fuel and oil pressures. I then repeated the same procedure to start the port engine. With both engines now started, Durda and I ran through the warm-up and ground test of engines and accessories. When all checked out, Durda informed the ordnance in the bow, cast off from the buoy. Buoy lines were released and we began to taxi into takeoff position. While taxiing, the engine would run up to check magnetos, and the takeoff list was run through by Durda and me. each one of us working the controls we were responsible for: wing flaps, cowl flaps, trim, control locks, etc. By now we had arrived at the runway marked by buoys, and when cleared by Seadrome control, we taxied into takeoff position. Crew stations for takeoff were predicated on total weight and fuel loading to ensure correct weight and balance. Normally for takeoff, the flight deck crew was 4 to 5 individuals. The remaining crew was divided between the waist compartment and the bunk room. The flight deck crew had seat belts, and the rest of the crew would sit facing backwards with their backs against the bulkhead. When cleared for takeoff, Joe put engines to full power and we started our takeoff run. As noted previously, takeoffs are always interesting. Sometimes water conditions made it rough. At other times, harbors were so crowded by small boat traffic, which at times inadvertently violated the runway space, and that made it very dangerous. Once airborne, we turned and flew back over the tender for a check of the IFF system, and then set course for the assigned patrol area. When clear of the harbor and on course, the pilot would signal general quarters. We had a klaxon horn on our plane, which was our GQ signal, and called for a check from all crew stations. Gunners would scramble for assigned position, test fire their guns, squeezing off 3 or 4 short rounds, and then reporting into the pilot, "Guns fired and ready, sir." The routine patrol started with constant surveillance of sea and sky by radar and by turret gunners and by waist hatch lookouts. The main concern, as mentioned on patrols out of Ulithi, was submarines hanging around the area because of the large concentration of shipping in this part of the Pacific. During the flight, we had a routine check-in every 30 minutes from all lookouts, each one worded similar to tail turret checking in, all is normal. The flight engineer was responsible for maintaining the flight log, a comprehensive check sheet completed every 30 minutes, which noted the plane's performance in such areas as oil and fuel pressure, cylinder head temperature, total fuel consumption, and so forth. Fuel was measured by the number of gallons burned per hour, per engine. I think it was Gil Gilliland, Crew 4, the most knowledgeable person I ever met about the PBM and its fuel system, who taught me the one for the wife and kids factor of reporting fuel consumption. Very simply, it was to reduce the amount of gas reported by 10 gallons for every hour we flew. Another approach was used by Bob Garrison, our plane captain. He had 2 children, so his rule of thumb was to always withhold 45 gallons for each child. These concepts were just good basic insurance against navigational errors and our unforeseen need for extra fuel. Flight engineers reported actual numbers. There were lots of stories in the patrol plane world about arriving back at base with only vapors in the tank. One of the ordnance men in the crew I was training after my overseas tour was a veteran of VPB-14, a PBY squadron. He told me about one of their patrols that lasted 18.4 hours. They took off with 1,450 gallons of gas and landed with about 15. We had several occasions in the squadron where a plane hung on its props after flying 18 or 19 hours and literally had little more than fumes remaining in the tanks once they touched down. Lee Orsack, who had replaced Paul Casey in our crew, was at the navigator's table working out the day's track. Harry Gardner was on the radio and Charles Ray manning the radar. When relieved, crew members would have breakfast prepared by the day's designated chef. The usual flight routine called for a regular shifting of operating positions every several hours. So after being relieved at the flight engineers panel, I went to eat some breakfast, grabbed a quick smoke on the flight deck, which was the only place you could smoke on the plane, then went to my primary duty position at tail gunner. In late morning, the sky was an azure blue with some puffy white clouds, and the sea was a dark blue with small, gently rolling whitecaps. Really a beautiful day for flying. Suddenly, John Looney, manning the radar, reported he had a target and notified Joe Dirta. "Looks like a large ship with a number of escorts." A few minutes later, as we entered some clouds at about 1,500 feet, and when we broke out into the clear, there was a heavy cruiser with escorts, one of ours. All guns were trained on us, and I remember thinking, I hope the IFF is working right. We were identified, and we quickly turned away, as the ship's gunners were famous for having itchy trigger fingers, and for good reason. Any plane was a threat until officially identified. It was a quiet day except for occasional intercom chatter. It was natural for your mind to wander as you continually surveyed the endless expanse of sky and sea. My mind often went back to the days before the Navy, the girls, high school, basketball, the drive-ins, good hamburgers, milkshakes, the Saturday nights with some nice 10-cent draft beers, mother's good cooking and plenty of it, sleeping till 10 a.m. on Saturday, all the things lacking in the here and now. I found this reminiscing kept me more alert on my lonely station. Around 12:30 I was relieved so that I could go forward and have lunch and a smoke. Then back to the turret and into my routine. In the early p.m. I notified Joe Dirt of a plane at about 3 o'clock level heading directly opposite to our track. We thought it might be a Betty, Japanese bomber, but he didn't see us and we both continued on our way. We now turned for home and the rest of the patrol was routine. We arrived back at the base about 16:30, 10 hours after leaving the buoy. After landing and tying up at the buoy, the watch crew remained on board and the rest left for the tender. Those with the night buoy watch would have early dinner, then they'd return to the plane to relieve the watch, who would then return to the tender for their chow and a night on the ship. The day after patrol was busy with general housekeeping, routine maintenance, and when necessary replenishing ordnance from a rearming barge. As I think back, a lot of us must have ear damage as a result of the noise level in the plane. The only semblance of soundproofing was on the flight deck, and that was an awfully quiet environment. My wife Joyce would certainly agree that I have suffered ear damage. The Mariner's Song. In keeping with the patrol theme, John Segru, an air crewman in Squadron VP B-26, wrote The Mariner's Song, which I think puts a good perspective on flying a patrol in the PBM. The hour is early, sun's over the horizon, the day almost whole. The crew assembles with gear and ration to once more begin a combat patrol. Now it's into the boat with a well-timed leap. Carelessness here meant physical pain. Out to the plane, which looks awkward and weak, while still imprisoned by its briny chains. Slowly it plows through the adhering water till permission is given and it's ready to fly. Then full power on, throwing spray in each quarter. It lumbers and shudders as if to die, bouncing and jouncing from one wave to the next, straining metal and man almost to the limit. She tears through the water at a breakneck speed, trying to break the attraction of it. The ride finally smooths as she rides up on the step, clipping each wave right at the top. Then one final bounce gives her extra pep, and it's into the air, shedding many a drop. She looks ungainly as she struggles for height. That changes slowly as she picks up speed. Soaring gracefully, she is quite a sight. True and dependable as a bold knight's steed. The flight is long, 12 hours or more, looking over a sea of innumerable waves, or carefully following some foreign shore, or watching the clouds from lofty caves. Boredom, an enemy, is still present. Ruthless and strong, it will test our mettle, but we fly on to fulfill our intent, to find the enemy and press the battle. The hours pass and we start our descent to the friendly waters of our home base, happy to see it still extant. It isn't much, but it's our place. Now back to the ship for food and rest, a nice clean bunk and a hot shower. We've given our all and done our best. The combat patrol is finally over. Enemy submarines. January brought the first real contacts with enemy submarines that were prowling the waters around Ulithi. On January 11th, a Dumbo plane from VH-1 sighted a submarine close to Yap Island, still a Japanese base of some importance. Yap had a good-sized garrison of troops, an airstrip mostly out of action but still operational at times, and a harbor where subs came in occasionally. A hunter-killer, ships and planes, operation was set in motion, and we flew several missions, including a special night mission on the 11th and two more the following morning attempting to find the elusive sub. Unfortunately, for all the effort put forth, no other contact was developed. No safe haven. In late 44, Ulithi had been selected by the Japanese High Command as the first target for their Special Attack Forces, Kaiten, human torpedoes. The worst casualty of the series of these attacks was the fleet oiler USS Mississippi, at anchor in the atoll and fully loaded with 400,000 gallons of aviation gas, 85,000 barrels of fuel oil, and 9,000 barrels of diesel oil. 50 officers and enlisted men were killed in the awful explosion that totally destroyed the 11,300-ton ship. Up until then, most everyone thought of Ulithi as a safe haven, a place for some rest and recreation. But now everyone knew they could be a target even with all the defensive armament available. My impression was that the Japanese, because of their Bushido philosophy, that things of the spirit are superior to material things, almost welcomed a chance to die for what they believed was an entirely worthy cause. Thus their philosophy about waging war against us, as stated by many of their leaders, was to match their training against our numbers and their flesh against our steel. Those are hard beliefs for us to understand and doubly hard to defend against. The atoll continued to be a favorite Japanese target during the remaining months of the war, and after the Mississippi disaster, Ulithi was a much more nervous place. About 7:10 on January 12, 1945, the entire harbor went on general quarters. The USS Mazana, an ammunition ship, was torpedoed not far from where the Chandeleur was anchored. According to the action report, the torpedo hit the Mazana in her number one hold where 5-inch ammunition was stored. It was a real miracle that the ammunition didn't explode. The ship stayed afloat even though there was significant damage to the forward portion of the ship. Surprisingly, only one crew member was killed. 20 were injured. The squadron ready crew, Sarge Gamble, Dick Sims, and Bob Watts, and Crew 12 were briefed and then departed to the plane immediately to assist in the search for the sub. Takeoff was at 8:15. Within 15 minutes they were patrolling over the area near the torpedoed ship. They relieved the 3 night ASP planes that had been searching the area. Gamble gambled that a submarine attempting to exit the lagoon would likely seek the shortest route, which would be the entrance at the northwest side of the atoll, and so informed Sims, who was flying his PPC. At 0956, as the plane was making a third pass over the northwest channel approach at about 500 feet, Warren Atkins, the deck turret lookout, reported, "I have a submarine on the surface about 1.5 miles away." The plane was on a different heading than the sub, so Sims immediately made a tight turn to port in order to begin an attack on the sub. The sub could now be clearly seen. It was leaving a noticeable wake as it headed out towards the open sea. As the plane turned, the sun came between the sub and the plane, and the pilots were blinded by the glare from the water and lost sight of the target for a few minutes. As the PBM skidded around in the end of its turn at about 100 feet altitude, suddenly all 3 pilots in the bow turret lookout sighted the target again. It seemed motionless and was just below the surface of the water. All 4 saw diving planes, a propeller at the stern, and a protuberance described by Sims as looking just like the PBM radar doghouse, which is a cover for the radar antenna. The sub was a cigar-shaped, rust-colored, and about 80 feet long and 10 to 15 feet in diameter. As the plane passed over the sub at 180 knots, the intervalometer was set for 80-foot spacing, and all 4 depth charges were released. Several other crew members reported in, and they were adamant that the target was a sub. They saw it plainly as it passed under the port wing only 100 feet below them. Both Sims and Gamble had conducted a number of depth charge attacks before, and felt that the concussions from this one were the heaviest they had experienced. The plane actually shook violently, enough that the fuel pressure on the starboard engine immediately fell off for 2 pounds, and the manifold pressure fell 4 inches. But even though Sims turned the plane sharply to port, the pilots could not directly observe any of the actual explosions. They did observe, however, heavy black smoke and several oil slicks. The waist hatch lookouts and the tail turret did observe the actual explosions. One took place directly ahead of the middle of the hull. One crew member described a second explosion, which seemed to emanate from the same spot, as throwing up a geyser of water and a shower of bits of metal. This attack took place about 4 miles west of the nearest group of ships anchored in the lagoon. Fortunately, a destroyer escort that had been patrolling nearby was immediately on the scene and began echo ranging with its sonar. Crew 12 kept marking the spot with smoke lights and dye markers, but no debris from the sub could be specifically identified as different from the usual harbor debris, boxes, boards, and other trash. Crew 12 continued to search the area until 12:45, when they returned to base and another of our planes took over. The constant search for the rest of the day by planes and ships resulted in no further sighting. Fortunately, a Marine pilot flying a TBF had witnessed the attack and stated that the 4 depth charges exploded close alongside the target, and a secondary explosion threw a high geyser in the air and metal shard all over the area. In the debriefing, he was unequivocal in stating the PBM did definitely destroy the object. Score 1 for VP-21. Later analysis verified that the target was a midget submarine that had been launched from a mothership identified as I-36, which had inadvertently run aground on a reef while approaching New Lethe, but was able to free itself and launch its midget sub. Enemy patrol plane. On the 12th, we were flying the night ASP around the atoll when John Looney, operating the radar, reported, "We're being shadowed by another plane." It was unidentified in the dark night, but thought to be a Japanese seaplane, an Emily, considered the best seaplane of World War II. Neither of us was aggressive, and probably good for us, as the Emily's tail turret was equipped with a 20-millimeter gun. Eventually our shadow had departed, and we continued our patrol through the night without further incident. Another submarine. In the early morning hours of January 21st, Crew 7, Ed Newkirk as PPC, and our PPC, Joe Durda, flying as first pilot, were covering ASP Section 2 about 40 miles off the atoll. George Walters, the radar operator, reported a contact, and although indistinct, Walters steered Newkirk towards the target. When about a mile or so away, visual contact was made by the third pilot, Jack Peacock, and by the bow turret lookout. An immediate challenge was made by Aldous Lamp. Just at that instant, both the deck and tail turret lookouts made visual contact with the sub running on the surface, with decks and conning tower awash. No response was received from continued Aldous Lamp signals. 2 aircraft flares were quickly released to illuminate the target preparatory to attacking. Unfortunately, visual contact was lost as the sub passed astern of the plane, and the flares extinguished themselves in the water. The tail turret reported that he had definitely seen the sub submerge, but was unable to locate a wake or a swirl where it had gone under. Newkirk and Durda continued to search the area while communicating with base. Suddenly another radar contact was made at about 15 miles distant. As the plane bore into about 3/4 of a mile from the new target, Newkirk started his attack run. Almost immediately, the deck turret reported seeing a green light. As green was the correct recognition signal, Durda flashed the aircraft recognition signal 4 times to the sub, all the while reporting to base. Base responded with a message to hold while they checked location of U.S. subs. Amazingly, another radar contact was reported at 9 miles, and again base was contacted, but again Newkirk was told to hold. Recognition signals were flashed but went unanswered. Then the blip disappeared. A last contact was made at 0412 when a target was detected at 14 miles. Again base was contacted and a permission was granted to attack, but by now radar as well as visual contact were lost. All 4 contacts were made over a 2.5-hour period within 6 miles of each other. So again, whether opportunity was lost due to confusion by base as to whereabouts of the U.S. subs or some other factor is unknown. This incident is just further proof to me that military intelligence is an oxymoron. When communication, confusion, and bureaucracy interfere with known facts, the opportunity is often lost, or worse, results in disaster. There's a whole litany of confusing situations. For example, the invasion of Tarawa, when misinformation on tides caused a great deal of chaos in the landing. The torpedoing of the USS Indianapolis, a fiasco caused by miscommunication and bureaucratic foul-ups, cost hundreds of lives, and the seemingly endless foul-ups for us when flying anti-submarine patrol. More subs and a kill assist. The enemy continued to lurk near the atoll, and on the night of January 21st, Crew 2, while on leg 3 of their patrol west of the atoll, had a radar contact at 20 miles. Paul Kingston, operating the radar, reported, "I have an unidentified target, but it might be a rain cloud." Frank Yorick homed in nevertheless, and when 2.5 miles from the suspected target, a wake was clearly visible. Yorick turned so that he might place the intended target in the moon's path, and at half mile felt definitely it was a sub. But he was now directly over the sub, and it was too late to launch an attack. He sent an immediate voice contact report and turned again to attack. But by the time he completed his turn, the sub had submerged, and he could not find the swirl where it had gone under. Yorick continued to circle the area and then ran a gambit towards the atoll to cut off the sub, if that was to be his intended target. When they closed in the atoll, Yorick again turned and headed back to the point of contact, and Kingston again picked up a radar target at about 4 miles. Recognition signals were sent, but no response was received, so Yorick made a quick 180-degree turn to port. Now both pilots, Yorick and Merrill observed the sub crash dive and distinctly saw the swirl. They bore in and released 2 depth charges and 1 Mark 34 mine from about 200 feet. Explosions were observed, but as the plane made a tight turn and flew over the explosion swirls, they saw no debris or oil. Chad Anderson, the tail turret lookout, reported the ordnance we dropped fell in the swirl and the explosion heaved water up in one huge mass, but I couldn't differentiate between individual explosions. It is believed that the ordnance impacted behind the submarine sub and definitely caused some damage to its aft end. They continued to search in the area for an hour, at which time they were relieved by another of our planes and returned to base. Hunter-killer operations were instituted immediately, and Marine TBFs as well as surface craft joined the fray. The search was gradually expanded, and at about 10:45 on the 22nd, after a definite contact, the sub was attacked and sunk near Yap Island, where he was undoubtedly heading for refuge. It was later confirmed that this was the sub Crew 2 had attacked. Conceivably, it was the same one Newkirk and Durda had sighted earlier, so VP B-21 came in for an assist as a successful conclusion of the mission. Later reports identified the submarine as the I-48, which was the mothership for an earlier abortive Caden attack at Ulithi. Night flying. I found night flying to be intriguing, sometimes gloomy and often scary. Rainstorms with terrific lightning had mystery and a certain beauty, particularly when the flashes bounced around on the clouds. Some nights, though, were so black it was like flying in ink. Darkness shields all the familiar things you see in the daytime flying, and you can feel very lonely. The farther north and west we flew, in the Pacific, the weather seemed less predictable, and the nights always seemed darker. I felt there was a certain disorientation at night in a turret, as you had no point of reference. You can see the stars and the exhaust stacks of the engines, but even they seemed unreal at times. When landing at night, I always thought it was tougher to get down. The water felt harder for some reason. Joe Dirty used to confuse things further with his humor. He'd get on the intercom and say, "Well, boys, my vertigo's pretty bad tonight, so let me know if we're upside down." One plus, however, was the ocean at night, at least in the Pacific. It had a good deal of phosphorescence, and often in the darkness you could track a target by following its wake. Buoy watch stories. Mogmog, as wild as it was at times, was a great respite for all of us. The Seadrome was near Mogmog, and small boats going to and from the beaches, as mentioned earlier, were often a hazard to the planes taking off and landing. One day, an overloaded Liberty launch with some loaded sailors on board floundered near several of our planes in the Seadrome. The buoy watch crews quickly broke out life rafts and aided in the rescue of a number of beer and water-soaked sailors struggling in the waters of the lagoon. In all honesty, I sort of enjoyed the night watches. It was unusually quiet out in the water. I will never forget once it was dark, how indescribable the heavens were, with thousands of stars. You felt you could reach up and touch them. I have never seen the multitude of stars like those anywhere else in all my years on this planet. And the sunsets were really memorable in the Pacific. Chad Alger, Crew 6, put in an artistic and yet realistic perspective. I recall sitting alone on top of the plane with an unobstructed view of the western horizon. I was swallowed up by the incredible beauty of the parade of yellow, orange, pink, and purple. The beauty and peace of the scene was overpowering. But then as darkness fell, thoughts returned to where we really were, and to the risks and uncertainties that would be confronted before the next sunset. The contradictions between the two worlds, nature and the wars of men, raised questions too difficult to even ponder. We had a nice little galley, and when we could scrounge supplies from ship's cooks, we had snacks on the plane. My specialty was the French fried potatoes. It was a time for conversation and reminiscing about girlfriends, wives, home, family, and particularly what we were going to do on leave. My constant reference to the camaraderie and closeness of crews was attributable in great part, as I said before, to the fact that we got to know each other so well because we were always together. And because still lonely from the other life we knew, this loneliness led to our being very candid and open about our lives and our desires and our wishes. That's how we got to know each other so well. Card games are always a great diversion, and pinochle seemed to be the game of choice for the enlisted men. I haven't played since leaving the Navy, but always thought it a great game. Poker was also a favorite, but it was often played on credit, as most of our pay was held in advance until we transitioned back to the States. I remember some really good games at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel at Waikiki Beach, where we got some R&R on the way home, and then a 3-day game on a train from San Francisco to Chicago on my way home for a 30-day leave. Paul Kingston, always one for a good story, loved buoy watch tales. One I remember in particular had to do with Dick Griesheimer of Paul's crew. One day at the buoy, Dick found out somehow that nearby was a supply ship loaded with beer. This prompted some quick action on Dick's part. He flashed a blinker message to the ship. "How about sharing some of your cargo?" The reply was instant. "Come on over and get it." So 2 of the crew took off in a life raft and brought back a goodly supply. For a long time, the crew members who were not on that day's watch believed Dick's story about the half-inflated life raft they saw when they arrived for night watch. Dick told them it had been used to scrub the sledge ring off the waterline of the hull. Once the truth was known about the real use of the life raft that day, it was obvious that a good party had to have taken place on the plane. Ensigns McFarland and McGrody finally admitted that they had a particularly good time, and that was why they had seemed a bit sluggish the following day. There were many, many more humorous tales, and several related to the toilet facilities on the plane. Chuck Bossert of Crew 7 was at Flight Engineers panel when radioman Mort Walters heard the call of nature and decided to tend to business and lighten up a bit. When he was finished, he dutifully went to the waste hatch to dispose of the bag. He unfortunately forgot to open the spoiler outside the hatch. His arm was no match for the slipstream that returned the bag back and up against the opposite bulkhead where it splattered in 100 directions. Either Dick Doyle or Ed Newkirk was on the intercom in a minute inquiring, "Bossert, did you just shit?" For the uninitiated, the toilet on the PBM used a brown waterproof bag as the receptacle. When one was through, the bag was to be disposed of through the waste hatch, but only when the spoilers were in the open position. In the same vein, on patrol one night, we had a captain who was flying as a passenger with us. He was on board to get his monthly flight time of 4 hours so he could collect his flight skins. He was not a pleasant person, as I learned when he got on. He ordered some coffee and food, which he did not think was up to standard. Anyway, he eventually had to use the facilities, but was not aware of the intricacies of disposal when done. I neglected to tell him to open the spoiler when he was ready to dispose of his bag. It hit the slipstream and came back and hit him in the chest. I spent the remainder of that patrol in the tail turret. We were all aware that there were rules about not swimming in the waters of the atolls because of the strange skin diseases common to the Pacific, let alone the strange fish. But like every other rule, some people still made it standard practice when on buoy watch to go swimming. One fine tropical evening, Crew 12 was taking their usual illegal dip out of the waste hatch and around to the wingtip float and back to the waste hatch. Don Deere told the story from there. All was serene, and all of us except George Driggers had gotten back in the plane. We heard a cry of consternation. It was George. We all ran back to the waste compartment to see what was happening. Looking out, we saw near the end of the wing, moving slowly and silently in the water, a shark's fin. George was standing on the port wingtip float, so all of us quickly climbed on the starboard wing to raise the port float out of the water. George was impatient, however, and throwing discretion to the winds, he took the initiative and dove into the water. With 2 Herculean strokes, he made it to the waste hatch and catapulted himself directly into the plane. No foot ladder for him. As I recall, the crew did not do much swimming after that, and George never did. Buoy watch did have a serious side, as evidenced by the fact that there have been occasions where Japanese swam out into the harbor under boxes or other trash with hand grenades to attempt to blow up planes. As explained earlier, we mounted regular armed watches after nightfall and were required to report in by blinker light to the tender every hour after dark. Each of us had to have some competence in Morse code in order to be able to send a basic message like, "Victor 14, all is well." The ship would signal back something like, "Roger, Victor 14, have your message." I can remember several times when the person on watch saw something suspicious floating in the harbor. Then a few shots would ring out, and then other buoy watch crews might join in the firing at the supposed target. That probably made it more dangerous for us in the crowded harbor than for any Japanese swimmer. Camaraderie defined again. Just as a family is the bellwether of society, the crew is the bellwether of a squadron. The longer a crew was together, the more efficient and effective it became. By January 45, all the crews had been through some exciting and difficult times. And I think that it obviously had a great deal to do with the camaraderie. Their discipline and direction became almost automatic. Everyone knew each other so well by then. We wouldn't do anything that would harm the crew or an individual in it. There are many instances in this dialogue of just that, doing what was best for the whole and not just the individual. We were truly brothers. As a generalization, there was a chasm between officers and enlisted men in the Navy, and fraternization between the two groups. As a generalization, there was a chasm between officers and enlisted men in the Navy, and fraternization between the two groups was generally frowned upon. This was probably due to the need to maintain a high order of discipline in order to live within the confines of shipboard life. The uniqueness of air crews, however, did away with most of those barriers, and the following comments attest to that. I'm convinced that this unique camaraderie allowed for better discipline in the long run because it was based on respect for the individual and not so much what rank the individual held in the hierarchy of the Navy. The following comments by several of our pilots and air crewmen are, I feel, a real testament to the thoughts espoused above. Norm Lorenzen, executive officer of the squadron, put it this way: the camaraderie and relationship of pilots and crews was extraordinary. The main thing that has stayed with me and impressed me over and over was the uniqueness of the relationship. In my crew, for example, Don Kramer, an aviation ordnanceman, and Vince Walker, an aviation machinist mate, were the best in their business. Both of them, on different occasions, risked their lives for the safety of the plane and crew. There was never a question or a bit of doubt. Whatever was required, they were doing it. I believe, based on my observation and pilots' comments, that every PPC, as well as the co-pilots, believed their crew was tops. If for some unusual reason pilots got separated from their crew, those of us who schedule flights heard a great many reasons why they shouldn't be scheduled to fly with other crews. Fortunately, it was a rare occurrence. The last 5 or 6 months I was in the squadron, Frosty Moore and I put the flight schedules together. One of us was responsible every other day. We might have gripes from pilots as to various flights assigned, but generally those were relatively few. We heard most PPCs praise their crews, speaking in laudatory terms about them and about the closeness of relationships. John Drover, PPC at Crew 14, said, I always felt there was a unique relationship between myself and my crew, a closeness that was evidenced by the time we spent together when not flying. Walter Melmar, first pilot of Crew 14, put it extremely well. Thank God for the expertise, teamwork, and the esprit de corps we had in our flight crews and supporting personnel. Without it, it would have been impossible to do all the tasks required to take off, getting airborne, flying missions, and returning to base in the middle of the Pacific with only an occasional radio signal for guidance and whitecaps that were used to determine wind velocity and direction. Plus, after landing, to conclude the remaining equally difficult task of sailing and maneuvering to a buoy or a beach dock with sea anchor to port and to starboard to port, etc., etc. John Valentine, pilot in Crew 10, said, the little things, but very important at the time, made us like brothers. A lot of feeling was also the hours spent together because of buoy watch. Todd Silverman, our radioman in Crew 5, put another spin on it. The camaraderie established during our relatively brief stay together was unbelievable. I had no contact with my crew from 1946 until 1992, and didn't see any of them until 1993. The camaraderie was there after nearly half a century. We hardly missed a beat in the BS. The time spent with my crew and others at squadron reunions has been extremely rewarding. In the same vein, the trust and dependency I referred to at the beginning of this story is what made the crews the teams they became. Chad Alger, Crew 6, talked about his PPC, Joe Pugh, who was a stickler for every detail and double-checked on everyone. He drove me to distraction, and I finally blew up one day and told him how I felt in very strong terms. Surprisingly, my respect for him grew tremendously when Joe said to me, you don't have to swear at me, Alger. He was a very savvy PPC with a highly interdependent crew, whom he recognized as very competent. a good example of the teamwork that made up our air crews. Another aspect of closeness and camaraderie not often talked about, but very real, was faith. It wasn't something that was worn on the sleeve, but as it always is in stressful situations, it was there. I would be the first to admit that my religious beliefs are not strong at this stage of my life, but on one occasion I did pray. I asked for my life when we lost our plane to Coastal Passage, and our life raft overturned in the raging sea of the typhoon. I knew I was drowning and asked God to help. I'm still here. I now have stronger beliefs. Norm Lorenzen put it in very realistic terms also. In September of '44 at Parry Island, during our first really bad tropical storm, patrols had to fly. The sea was extremely rough that day. We had a terrible time just boarding the plane. We were using rubber rafts because the normal boat transport was inoperable. As we approached the plane, the raft went up as the plane went down, and it would pitch and roll as we attempted to board. Finally, we all made it, and then both crew and pilots spent some time talking about takeoff procedures. We made our takeoff, and when finally airborne, I asked the crew of the intercom, "What were you guys doing as we made our run?" "Hanging on and praying hard," was the unanimous response. John Valentine talked about the time when his crew had their crash in the LSC and had 5 crew members killed. "I was in the front section of the plane when we hit, and the plane broke in half. Suddenly I was down about 15 feet in the water. My mind turned to my wife and our expected child. I prayed to God that I could get out in order to get back to her, and He gave me the strength to accomplish that. The first Sunday I was out of sick bay, I was in the front row at services." We all prayed at times, but like a lot of other things, we wouldn't admit it openly. As Norm noted, that wasn't the last time prayers were said. I was also aware that a good many officers and enlisted personnel attended church services wherever we were stationed. That indicated to me that faith was part of being in VPB 21. Radioman's Lament. Ted Stoddard of Crew 5 put a perspective on the radioman's job. Many of the PBM-3S and PBM-3D model planes we flew in training had the GO-9 radio transmitters, black Goliaths, that stood on the deck just after the radioman's position. The radioman faces the bulkhead after the co-pilot and pilot. The GO-9 had a lot of panels and wheels and dials, and as I recall, it had to be reset every time a different frequency was used. This involved setting the frequency on a master oscillator, feeding it in through an amplifier, and then compiling the signal to the antenna. It was powerful, however, especially when a trailing wire antenna was deployed. One of my favorite memories of it is a song that was a radioman's parody of the popular 40s tune, "Cuddle Up a Little Closer, Lovey Mine." It went as follows: "Cuddle up a little closer, GO9. Couple up and be my super heterodyne. Love your master oscillator and your power amplifier. Cuddle up a little closer, GO9. Chad Alger, being a radioman, liked the bulky GO9 and said, "I had full confidence in it. You could open it up and look inside, and I knew how to make simple repairs with a screwdriver and pliers." When the PBM-5s came out on the scene, they had a Bendix transmitter, and it was a whole new technology. Only highly trained technicians knew what was inside. You could set several frequencies, and then when you dialed a specific frequency, the dials automatically turned to the appropriate settings. It bothered me, though, that we had such a radical change in our communication equipment only a few days before moving into the most dangerous of our assignments, Okinawa. Back to Saipan. On January 28, 1945, VPB-22 arrived at Ulithi to relieve us so that we could move to our new base at Saipan. They unfortunately arrived with a number of their planes needing serious maintenance, and as a result, we left several crews at Ulithi for a week or so to assist in flying patrols until Squadron 22 was fully operational.